It wasn't the cold of the operating table that stayed with her. It wasn't the smell of antiseptic so sharp it burned the back of her throat. Or the sound of the monitors screaming a single flat note where her heartbeat used to be. What stayed with Madeleine Okafor was the window. The small rectangular window set into the door of the surgical suite at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And the face she saw framed in it. She had been 38 weeks pregnant when the placental abruption began. The nurses moved fast, faster than Madeleine had understood was possible, and somewhere in the blur of hands and IV lines and someone shouting her blood pressure numbers across the room, she had looked toward that window expecting to see her husband. Instead she saw Renata Solis, her husband's colleague from the architecture firm where he worked, the woman he had mentioned casually, maybe a dozen times, the woman he described as driven, brilliant, a little intense, just someone from the office. Renata was standing perfectly still in the corridor outside, looking through the glass directly into the surgical suite, and she was smiling. Not the anxious smile of someone waiting for news, not the crumpled expression of someone scared. It was a full, quiet, satisfied smile. The kind of smile a person wears when something they've been hoping for is finally happening. Madeleine looked at her for exactly 3 seconds before everything went dark. She didn't know she had died. She found that out later, that her heart had stopped for 94 seconds, that the surgical team had performed CPR while simultaneously trying to deliver her daughter, that the attending physician, Dr. Anand Chowdhury, had later told her mother it had been the most terrifying delivery of his career. She didn't know any of that in the moment. In the moment there was simply nothing, and then there was a ceiling and a voice and a hand on her arm. "Madeleine, can you hear me? You're in the ICU, you've been unconscious for 2 days." Her mouth felt like it was packed with gauze. Her whole body was a dull, enormous ache. She turned her head and saw her mother Josephine, sitting in the chair beside the bed with her coat still on like she had arrived and never thought to take it off. "The baby?" Madeleine said, or tried to say. What came out was barely a sound. "She's here." Josephine's voice broke on the second word. "She's in the NICU. She's small, Maddie, but she's breathing on her own. They say she's strong." Madeleine closed her eyes. A daughter. She had known, had seen it on the ultrasound, had spent months imagining her. She was here. That was the only thing that mattered. Then the next thought arrived, inevitable as weather. "Where's Daniel?" Her mother's face did something complicated. She reached out and took Madeleine's hand, and the gesture itself was the answer before any words came. "He was here," Josephine said carefully. "On the first day, for a few hours, and then he left." Madeleine waited. "He said he needed air, that he needed to process." Josephine's jaw was tight. "He said he'd be back. He has not been back." The monitor beside the bed registered a spike. A nurse appeared in the doorway, assessed the numbers, glanced at Josephine. "There's more," Madeleine said. It wasn't a question, she could see it in the careful way her mother was holding herself together. "Your friend Priya told me." Josephine stopped, started again. "One of the nurses on duty that night. She saw a woman in the corridor outside your room, when the alarms went off, when they were trying to bring you back." Madeleine already knew. She had known since the moment she regained consciousness, though she hadn't allowed herself to fully think it yet. "Renata," she said. Her mother looked at her. "You knew?" "I saw her. Right before I lost consciousness. She was looking through the window." Madeleine's voice was very steady. She noticed this about herself with a kind of distant interest. "The way you notice the weather from inside a building." She was smiling. Josephine pressed her lips together. "The nurse said," she laughed, "Maddie. When the alarm sounded, when they were running in to save you. This woman stood in the corridor and she laughed." The monitor beeped faster. Madeleine breathed through it. "And Daniel?" "The security footage shows him in the waiting room when it happened. He stood up. He looked toward your room." Josephine's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. And then Renata put her hand on his arm and he sat back down. Outside the window the Toronto skyline was gray and flat, mid-November, the lake invisible in the distance. Madeleine lay in her hospital bed and felt something settle in her chest that was quieter and colder and more durable than grief. It wasn't rage, not yet, it was clarity. She had almost died. Her daughter had been born into chaos and fear, and her husband had sat in the waiting room with the woman he was sleeping with and done nothing. "I want to see my daughter," Madeleine said. They brought her to the NICU in a wheelchair. 2 days later, when the doctors decided she was stable enough, her daughter was in an isolette in the corner, 5 pounds and 3 ounces, her face scrunched with the effort of existing in a world that had surprised her by arriving early. She had a full head of dark hair. She had Madeleine's nose. Madeleine reached through the opening in the isolette and pressed one finger against her daughter's palm. The baby's hand closed around it immediately, grip certain and fierce. "Hi," Madeleine said softly. "I'm your mum. I'm sorry I took so long." She named her Ivy. Daniel had wanted something else. He'd had a list. They'd argued about it pleasantly for months. But Daniel wasn't here, and so Ivy it was. The NICU nurse wrote it on the card above the isolette and said it was a lovely name, and Madeline agreed. Daniel called that evening. She let it go to voicemail. Then she listened to the message, his voice careful and rehearsed, saying he was sorry, that things had gotten overwhelming, that he needed a little more time to process everything. He did not ask about the baby by name because he didn't know the name. He didn't ask whether Madeline was in pain. He mentioned, near the end, that he was staying with a friend. Madeline deleted the message and called her lawyer. She had gone to school with Beatrix Fenmore. They'd been in the same constitutional law seminars at Osgood 2 decades ago, before Madeline shifted into corporate consulting and Beatrix became the kind of family lawyer that people called a piranha, affectionately behind her back. Beatrix picked up on the second ring. "I heard," Beatrix said without preamble. "Josephine called me when you were still unconscious. Are you okay?" "I'm alive. Ivy is alive. Daniel left the hospital to be with his girlfriend while I was being resuscitated." A pause. "Tell me everything." She did. Beatrix listened without interrupting, and when Madeline finished there was a silence that felt like a coil being wound very tight. "I want to file for divorce," Madeline said. "I want sole custody. I want the house. And I want this done before he has time to organize himself." "I can do all of that," Beatrix said. "But Madeline, I have to ask, do you have any evidence beyond the nurse's account?" "There's security footage from the hospital." Another pause, this one different in quality. "How much footage?" "Enough. A security officer came to speak with me. She showed me the waiting room. She showed me the corridor. She showed me Renata's face when the alarm sounded." Madeline's voice didn't waver. She laughed. "Beatrix, there are cameras. There are nurses who will give statements. And there's footage of Daniel leaving the hospital with her while I was in emergency surgery." "I'll file Monday," Beatrix said. "First thing." The divorce papers arrived at the house. Their house, the semi-detached in Leslieville they'd renovated together 3 years ago, on a Wednesday. Madeline heard about it through Beatrix, who heard about it through Daniel's lawyer, a man named Jeffrey who had the defensive, slightly panicked energy of someone who had just realized how bad his client's situation actually was. Daniel did not call after being served. He posted on Instagram instead, a photograph of a sunset over Lake Ontario, captioned with something about transitions and growth and finding peace in uncertainty. He had 17 comments within an hour. Several of his friends, people Madeline had cooked dinner for, people she had hosted at their house on Canada Day, left supportive messages about honoring his journey. Renata liked the post within minutes. Madeline's friend from her book club, a woman named Suki, screenshot the post and sent it to Madeline with a single message. "Is he serious right now?" Madeline stared at it for a long moment. Then she opened her phone's notes app and began a log. Date, time, content of post, names of people who engaged. Evidence was evidence. Ivy came home 6 weeks after she was born, small enough that her car seat looked almost comically large around her, her eyes tracking the winter light with the serious expression of someone taking careful notes. Madeline's mother had moved in, temporarily they said, and then stopped saying it because it was clearly not temporary, because temporary implied Madeline had another option. And Madeline did not yet have another option. She was running on 5 hours of sleep at best. She was still healing from an emergency C-section and the additional surgical repair required after the abruption. She was breastfeeding every 2 to 3 hours. She was coordinating with Beatrix on the divorce proceedings, documenting every day that Daniel did not make contact with his daughter, responding to the well-meaning and occasionally insufferable messages from mutual friends who wanted her to consider both sides. She blocked 14 people in one evening. Josephine watched from the kitchen doorway and said nothing, just refilled Madeline's tea. Daniel resurfaced in January. He texted, not called, texted, to say he wanted to text Ivy and to discuss arrangements. Madeline forwarded the text to Beatrix and then, on Beatrix's advice, replied that all communication regarding their daughter should be directed through their respective counsel. He showed up at the house 2 days later anyway, rang the doorbell at 7 in the evening when Ivy had just gone down. Madeline opened the door because the alternative was letting him stand on the porch long enough for the neighbors to notice. He looked rough, thinner, unshaven in a way that didn't suit him, circles under his eyes that she recognized from the early years of their marriage, when he'd been working impossible hours trying to make partner. He stood on her doorstep. On his doorstep, technically his name was still on the deed, and said, "I just want to talk." "You had 2 months to want to talk," Madeline said. "I know, I was." He stopped, started again. "I wasn't in a good place. I was dead, Daniel, for 94 seconds. I was clinically dead while you sat in the waiting room with a woman who was laughing about it." He flinched. It was the first time she'd said it to his face and she watched the words land. "I didn't know," she laughed. "I didn't see that." "There's footage," Madeline said. "The hospital has cameras in that corridor. So if you're planning to dispute what I saw, you should know that what I saw is documented. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to see my daughter. Speak to your lawyer. She closed the door. She stood with her back to it for 30 seconds, listening to her own breathing, and then walked back to the kitchen where her mother was pretending to read, and asked her to please make more tea. The custody hearing was in March. Beatrix had filed for sole custody with supervised visitation contingent on Daniel completing a parenting assessment and demonstrating consistent involvement, a condition he had thoroughly failed to meet in the 5 months since Ivy's birth. Madeline attended in a charcoal blazer and her most sensible boots, prepared. Daniel's lawyer argued that his client had been experiencing significant psychological distress in the aftermath of the traumatic birth, and deserved the opportunity to be present in his daughter's life going forward. The judge, an unimpressed woman named Justice Ferrara, reviewed the documentation Beatrix had compiled, the hospital security footage, the nursing staff statements, the record of zero contact with the baby, the social media posts showing leisure activities in the weeks following the birth, the text message log demonstrating that Daniel's first attempt to make contact was 47 days after Ivy came home from the NICU. Justice Ferrara looked at Daniel over the top of her reading glasses. "You have a great deal to make up for," she said. The judgment awarded Madeline sole custody. Daniel was granted supervised visitation, 2 hours every 2 weeks, contingent on consistent attendance and payment of child support. He was also ordered to complete a parenting course. He attended his first supervised visit on a Tuesday in April. Ivy was 4 months old, smiling at things she found interesting, batting at the mobile Josephine had hung above her play mat. The contact center supervisor reported afterward that Daniel had seemed unprepared. He hadn't known what to do when Ivy fussed, had handed her back to the supervisor to be settled, had spent a portion of the visit on his phone. He wanted to be her father, Madeline said to Beatrix after reading the report. He just didn't want to actually do it. That's most of them, Beatrix said, not unkindly. The divorce was finalized in June. Madeline got the house. She got a settlement that covered 4 years of a nanny or 1,001 other things she would figure out along the way. She got Ivy entirely and without qualification. She also, somewhere in the months between the hospital and the courthouse, got a podcast. It had started almost by accident. A friend from her old corporate consulting network had reached out after hearing what happened. Word travels fast in Toronto's professional world, and suggested Madeleine write about the experience. "You have a way of making sense of things," the friend said. "You always have." Madeline wrote a piece instead for a newsletter she'd started and abandoned twice, and it had been shared 6,000 times before she realized what was happening. The response was from women, mostly. Women who had been through variants of the same story. Women who were in the middle of it. Women who had come out the other side and wanted to compare notes. They wrote to her at all hours, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in long careful paragraphs that had clearly taken days to compose. She started recording conversations with some of them. Informal, honest, an hour over video call. She called the podcast After the Fact, because that was what you were, afterward, a fact. Something that had happened. Something that had survived its own happening. Within 3 months she had 40,000 listeners. Within 6, she had a producer. His name was Marcus. She stopped herself. She needed a name that wasn't on that list. His name was Solomon Park. He had produced 2 other shows she respected, was direct in a way that felt like respect rather than bluntness, and sent her an email so carefully considered that she had read it 3 times before responding. He wanted creative control to remain with her. He wanted to grow the show without changing its nature. He understood what it was and why it worked. "You're not trying to fix people," he told her in their first call. "You're just showing them that being broken doesn't have to be the final thing." "That's exactly it," she said. The show grew. She interviewed lawyers and therapists and financial advisors, the infrastructure of leaving, of rebuilding. Things no one tells you about when they hand you the clichés about closure and moving on. She interviewed women in Calgary and Halifax and Vancouver who had been through divorces that looked nothing like hers but felt, in the bones, exactly the same. She talked about the NICU, about the 94 seconds, about the window and Renata's face. That episode had 200,000 downloads in its first week. Renata's name started appearing in comment sections. People found her professional profiles. The architecture firm where she and Daniel had worked quietly let her go. Madeline heard this through a former colleague and did not feel the satisfaction she had expected. She felt, mostly, tired. Daniel was not doing well. She heard this too, through the same porous membrane of mutual acquaintance that had carried her own story so efficiently through the city. He had moved into a rental apartment in Etobicoke. He and Renata had ended things, had apparently ended things dramatically, with a scene in their building's lobby that the property manager had had to intervene in. He had missed 2 of Ivy's supervised visits. Beatrix filed a motion noting the missed visits. The court modified the order. Any further missed visits without documented medical reason would result in his visitation being suspended. He missed another one. Madeline was at home when Beatrix called to tell her. Ivy was in the play yard in the living room, standing now, pulling herself up on the mesh sides with an expression of tremendous satisfaction. Josephine was in the kitchen doing something with lentils that smelled like her own childhood. He missed it again, Beatrix said. I know. Madeline had gotten the call from the contact center an hour earlier. The court will likely suspend visitation at this point. I want you to be prepared for how you feel about that. Madeline watched her daughter pull herself to standing, wobble. Hold on. I feel relieved, she said. And sad for Ivy. Not for him. That's the right order, Beatrix said. The podcast reached 100,000 subscribers by Ivy's first birthday. Solomon had negotiated a deal with a production network that allowed Madeline to keep editorial control and earn enough that she could reduce her consulting work to 2 days a week. She used the extra time to be with Ivy and to write. The book had been suggested by 6 different people before she took it seriously. She had resisted it. It felt like too much, like turning her worst year into content. But then a woman named Deborah had sent her a voice message through the podcast's website. A 7-minute recording of a woman sitting in a hospital parking lot. Because she didn't know how to go back inside and tell the nurses she was leaving her husband of 18 years. Deborah had found the podcast on her phone while she sat there. She had listened for 2 hours. Then she had gone back inside. Madeline wrote the book in Ivy's nap times. It took 8 months. She called it The Window. After the moment she had seen Renata's face, after the things she had understood in that instant about who her husband was and what her life had actually been, it debuted at number 4 on the Globe and Mail bestseller list. By the second week it was number 1. She was invited to speak at a conference in Vancouver in March. Ivy was 14 months, walking now with the slightly alarmed expression of someone who kept surprising themselves. And she almost said no because leaving Ivy felt impossible. Then Josephine pointed out, with her particular brand of gentle precision, that Ivy would be fine for 2 nights, and that Madeline was allowed to exist in the world as a person, not only as a mother. She gave the keynote. A woman came up afterward and told her she had read the book 4 times. Another woman told her she had left because of the book. A third pressed her hand and didn't say anything at all, and Madeline understood that sometimes that was the one that meant the most. She met someone at the conference. Not in a way she was expecting or looking for. His name was Franklin Achibi. He was a grief counselor who specialized in sudden loss. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself, that arrives like a weather event, and leaves you standing in the wreckage wondering what the sky looked like before. He had lost his wife 4 years earlier. He had a son who was 7 and thought very seriously about trains. He introduced himself after her keynote. He said he recommended her podcast to clients. He said it had helped him personally understand the difference between grief and betrayal, that those were 2 different rooms even when they felt like the same building. That's exactly what it is, she said. 2 different rooms. He asked if she wanted to have coffee and then immediately said she probably had a full schedule and he didn't want to impose. She had in fact a very full schedule. She said yes anyway. They talked for 2 hours. He was direct and funny and honest about his own still incomplete healing, which she found more attractive than confidence would have been. He didn't try to extend the conversation beyond what was natural. When it was time to go, he shook her hand and said it was genuinely good to meet her. She thought about him on the flight home, not obsessively, just in the mild, curious way that means something is allowed to occupy space. They stayed in touch. Professionally first. He sent her an academic paper on ambiguous loss that he thought might interest her. She sent him an episode she thought his clients might find useful. Then less professionally, in the way that happens when 2 people who have both been through something real find each other interesting. He texted her a photo of his son in front of a model locomotive with an expression of pure religious devotion. She sent him a video of Ivy attempting to eat a piece of banana with the focused fury of someone defusing a bomb. She was careful. She was honest with herself that she was being careful and that this was appropriate, and that appropriate did not mean permanent. In the meantime, her life was full, in the particular way that fullness looks when you have built it yourself out of necessity. The podcast, the book, the consulting work she still found genuinely interesting. The early mornings with Ivy when the house was quiet and the light came through the kitchen window in a way that felt almost deliberate. Her mother's lentils. Beatrix's occasional dry assessments of Daniel's ongoing failure to organize himself. Suki's book club, which had become in practice a standing appointment for 6 women to drink wine and talk about their lives. Daniel's visitation was formally suspended in the fall, 8 months after Ivy's first birthday. He hadn't made a visit in 6 months. He hadn't paid child support in 3, and Beatrix had filed for contempt. He was living by various accounts in a sequence of short-term arrangements that suggested someone whose life had come significantly unmoored. Madeline did not feel satisfied by this. She had expected to feel satisfied, and instead felt something more like a settled weight. The recognition that she had protected her daughter, that Ivy's life was stable and warm, and full of people who showed up, and that this had cost Daniel his access to all of it. And that was a consequence he had created entirely on his own. She said as much in an episode of the podcast. The response was significant. Thousands of messages over the following week, from women who needed to hear that not feeling vindicated was also a valid feeling, that you could grieve the father your child would not have without mourning the man who chose not to be him. Franklin listened to that episode in his car in a parking lot in Hamilton, and texted her afterward. That one hit different. Thank you for making it. She called him instead of texting back. They talked for an hour. At the end of it he said, I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as colleagues and not as friends. I want to be clear about what I mean. She sat with that for a moment. I'm slow, she said. I need things to be slow. I know, he said. I've read the book. She laughed. It was the first time in a long time that she had laughed at something that caught her off guard. They had dinner 2 weeks later. It was careful and good, the conversation that kind, that moves easily between serious and light without effort. He asked about Ivy and listened to the answers the way people listen when they actually want to know, not when they're waiting to speak. She asked about his son. His name was Kwame, 7 years old, very serious about trains and also recently about the Raptors. He sounds like he has strong opinions, she said. The strongest, Franklin said. He gets it from his mother. He said it simply, without the careful dance she had noticed in other people around the subject of his wife. Like it was true and real and still present, and also not the whole story of his life. On the walk back to where they had parked he said, I want this to go somewhere. I don't want to push, and I don't want to pretend I don't want it. So I'm just saying it and leaving the rest to you. She stopped walking. The November air was sharp and smelled like the lake. I want it to go somewhere too, she said. But Ivy comes first, always. And I'm still healing, he said. I know, so am I. I think that can be true at the same time as this. She thought about the monitor in the ICU, the spike in her heartbeat when she had first understood what her husband had done. She thought about Ivy's hand closing around her finger in the NICU, certain and fierce. She thought about the window. Okay, she said. Let's see. They took it slowly. It took the shape of regular calls, occasional dinners when he drove down to Toronto, 2 occasions when she drove to Hamilton and met Kwame, who assessed her with the impartial gravity of a 7-year-old, and then showed her his entire train set, which she understood was a significant honor. Ivy, by the time she was 2, had started saying his name. The book's second printing sold out. A documentary producer approached Madeline's team about a film adaptation. A foundation for women navigating contentious divorce proceedings reached out about a partnership. The podcast passed 300,000 subscribers. Through all of it, Madeline went to therapy every Thursday. She had started 6 weeks after Ivy came home from the hospital and had not stopped. She didn't talk about it on the podcast because she thought the podcast talked about enough, but she also didn't hide it, because the whole point was to be honest about what rebuilding actually looked like, which was slow and non-linear and requiring more support than one person can provide herself. One Thursday in February, almost 2.5 years after the night at St. Michael's, her therapist asked her something she had never quite asked before. When you think about that night, the room, the window, Renata's face, what do you feel? Madeline thought about it. Outside the therapist's office window the city was doing its winter thing, gray and stubborn and eventual. Nothing much, she said finally. It feels like something that happened to someone I used to be. Is that distance or is it healing? I think it's both, Madeline said. I think they're the same. She drove home through the city she had lived in her entire adult life. Past the hospital where her daughter had been born. Past the neighborhood where she and Daniel had lived before Leslieville. Past the coffee shop near the law school where she and Beatrix had once stayed until closing time arguing about a case study, and hadn't realized until they got outside that it had snowed 8 centimeters while they were inside. The city was full of the versions of herself she used to be. She drove through them and arrived home. Ivy was in the kitchen with Josephine, engaged in the serious project of decorating a biscuit. She looked up when Madeline came in and said with flour on her face, "Mummy, we made stars." "I can see that," Madeline said, crouching down to her level. "They're beautiful." "This one's yours," Ivy said, and handed her a lopsided, heavily iced star with such complete confidence in its value that Madeline felt something she could only call happiness, uncomplicated and entire. She held the biscuit. She looked at her daughter. She thought, as she sometimes still did, of the window, and then she put it down. The window, the 94 seconds, Renata's smile. Put it down in the way you set something heavy on a shelf and finally stop wondering if you'll need to carry it again. Not because it hadn't happened, not because it hadn't mattered, but because the kitchen was warm and her daughter was covered in flour, and her mother was pretending not to watch, and this, all of this ordinary rebuilt chosen life, was what she had come back for.